It's a nasty, rainy day out. So, we're doing this inside. Misha here. And last time we dove into the Daewoo K2 and the current status of S&T Defense S&T USA. This time I thought we would look at the gun the Daewoo K2 is expressly designed to go up against. Also just because it's on the table at the moment. The underappreciated but still very cool, and we'll probably never see these imported again, unfortunately, the K1 A1 Max 1. This was their submachine gun. Well, the other submachine gun was a little bit different. But these are developments from South Korea, the ROK, to combat the North in its series of AKs, and for that matter SKSs, and other Soviet-style guns. And here we have one of the Atlantic, so-called Asian contract AKs in 7.62x39. Yes, the parts are from a North Korean Type 68. Something we never thought we would get here, to be honest with you. And this is one of the few times when I don't mind having a parts kit build AK. I mostly prefer factory built imports. But when you have something like this, or an East German, where we're never ever going to get them, this is the best we can do. In fact, because of the political situation, it was, well, pretty creative how we got these. And I'm going to tell you this too. I know I didn't just recently pick this up. I didn't realize it was already 2.5 years I've had this. Whew. I mean, usually I'm pretty good with time, but that one took me a little aback when I went to check out the day J-Ro and I first took it out shooting. Oh well. Time flies. Typically not when you want it to. But we did run the first shots through it out here at the cabin land before the cabin had even been built. Asian contract, first shots. And it ran well that first day. And I haven't brought it out much since, just because a lot of other things on my mind. But it was time to bring her out again. So we're going to get some updated shooting footage with the 7.62-39 that I do have, which is not a lot, guys. You know the status these days. That said, if you'd like to help support the channel, get some more ammo and what have you, you can always do a super thanks here on YouTube, or you can check us out on Patreon. If not, I understand it's the holidays, we're all strapped, but liking, sharing, and subscribing, and commenting more than anything, you know it does help a lot with YouTube. With that, let's compare and contrast this with the Daewoos, and talk about what makes the North Korean AK series unique, special, and at the same time similar to not the Chinese, that's not really what they base these on, but Russian. Our story really begins when Soviet Russia starts to become a very active benefactor, patron of North Korea, with President Kim Il-sung. In the very first Russian gun they manufactured in country was a variant of the PPSH-41, the Papa Shah, the burp gun, known as the Type 49. But mostly they're importing guns and using leftover guns from all the various wars. The AK was actually the second Russian gun domestically produced in Korea, North Korea, as the Type 58. And it's the same pattern we see with other Soviet production. They first get some from Russia, then they get technical assistance, they get Soviet supervisors, engineers, consultants, and they get parts, and they'll start assembling, and then they will transition over to making more and more parts domestically. And by the end, they're pretty much making them all in-house with some localizations and customizations, and otherwise sticking to Soviet spec. So the original Type 58 looked very, very similar to the late style AK-47, the milled Type 3. Of course, it had a machined receiver, a 16 1/4 medium heavy profile barrel. It had a blued finish, and it had either a fixed wood stock or an underfolding metal stock. It's usually attributed to Type 58 and Type 58-1 respectively, and it typically is fed from steel standard capacity magazines. And it took a Type 1 style bayonet, all that good stuff. So how do you tell a Korean from a Russian? Obviously, the markings. Korea used a 5-pointed star. That, again, the communist nations love them some stars, and they're always a little different. Obviously, the serial was a little different. And then the bluing. The Russian guns were blued, the Koreans were blued, but the Korean guns were known to have a kind of more matte bluing, mostly because they just didn't put as much final fit and finish into the externals as the Russians did. Just a little less bit and polish. I will say, though, the internals did get about the same level of treatment, so they just deleted some things. But one of the big areas to tell is actually the wood furniture. Now, this is, of course, a Type 68 kit, but the furniture is strictly carried over. So this same grip and forearm, and for that matter, same style of stock, were on the original 58. And this is an interesting type of wood. This is katapa wood, which is actually native to where I live here. It came from the central and southern USA near the Mississippi River, although it's spread around the world into, yes, China and Korea. All right, second meg. So why pick katapa wood? It's kind of like pine. It's a lighter wood. It's pretty porous, and it is easy to work, and it has pretty good properties there. But it does not have a very even finish. It's pretty soft. But it's very popular for outdoors activities. It's very corrosion. It's very rot and just otherwise deterioration resistant. So it's used for a lot of outdoor things like fence posts and outdoor structures like pole barns and that kind of thing. Not the most attractive wood, and again, it's not the easiest to kind of give a nice external finish to. So it's more of a workmanship style. It also grows very fast, katapa trees do, so it's more easily replenished. So I don't blame them. It's not the most attractive, perhaps, like some walnuts and stuff, but for just an outdoors type gun that's going to get wet and stuff, it makes a lot of sense, and it's available, and you see it in a lot of things. So that's one way to really identify the Korean manufactured guns. Otherwise, pretty much the same old thing, though. And they would begin making these in 1958, not surprisingly, at both Factory 61 and Factory 65. Again, this is under the orders of President Kim Il-sung at the time. And at the time, their military is 300. Eventually, it'll grow to nearly 400,000 people. Not the biggest in the world. And over a decade, they'll make about 800,000 Type 58s. But they're not all for their own use. They do export them to friendly communist nations. The big ones you think of are Cuba, who got some from them when they couldn't get enough from Russia, and Vietnam, who was taking all AKs, especially once the war kicked off. Obviously, they were fighting the French, and then they fought the Americans. And eventually, Vietnam would also fight the Chinese. So there's that. A lot would go there. From that point, the Type 58 would start to spread throughout the Middle East, Africa, and eventually even South America, going to various communist rebels and revolutionary groups, getting around the world. So of the 800,000, many would be with the People's Army in North Korea, but a lot would go around the world. To that end, and because it was a milled gun, so production was somewhat slow, they did also adopt the SKS. But uniquely in North Korea, it was in production after the AK. We don't typically see this. Yeah, SKS is usually going to production before AKs, not after. But that's not what they did. Introduced as the Type 63 for the year 1963, the SKS was really meant as a stopgap, to have enough to give to those when they didn't have enough AKs to go around. So they served concurrently. The 58 was meant to be kind of the frontline premier, with the 63 for reservists and police. And as China showed us, in the hands of a good marksman, you can squeeze a little more range, maybe just a little bit better accuracy out of a SKS versus an AK, but it has to be in the right hands. So that's kind of what was going on. And the military, like I said, was, a few 100,000. Depends how you kind of consider it. In communism, everyone can be a soldier if they tell you to be. But around 1972, an effort's made to expand the military. And you start to see it grow. 400,000, 700, then 950,000. It hits a peak around 1992 of over 1 million. I've seen 1.2. And we're going to need more guns quicker to supply them. Not to mention, North Korea has found a way to have influence around the world, and that's to sell small arms. And that's the one thing they do have. They have labor. They don't have a lot of advanced tooling and a lot of, cutting edge stuff. They have basic machines, and they have people to work them.
Asian, one more time.
Thus, we finally come to the Type 68. Often thought of as their AKM, it really isn't. It's a similar thing to what China did when they went from the milled Type 56 AK to the stamped. But when China did that, China had the original, we'll call it TDP, for the Type 56 milled. When they went to the stamped 56, they reverse engineered a type of stamped receiver for that. Well, North Korea actually was still on good relations with Russia, so Russians helped them set up the Type 68 production line. It doesn't seem like they ever used Russian parts, and we don't really know to what extent the Russians were there, but on some level, there were Russian technical advisors and assistants to kind of get the stamped receiver up and running. So that's the big deal. We went from a milled receiver to a stamped. And we would introduce some other stamped parts to save on time and steel and also up production rate. And we're going to switch over at both factories, 61 and 65. But what's interesting about this, a lot of original AK-47 features are carried over in one way or another. I already mentioned the Katapa wood furniture. Also, this still has a machined style underfolding stock. And it's the original AKS style that only latches on one side, not two like in AKMS. And if you notice, it does have more of a downward sweep than you'd expect on an AKMS. But we do carry over the non-lightning cut carrier. Let's put a pin in that for a minute. A lot of other machined parts. And the barrel is an interesting deal. It is a 16 1/4 inch barrel, and it is a lighter profile than the original Type 58. However, where it mates up with the trunnion, it's a larger style, more like it's a hybrid. Some parts of it have AKM dimensions, some have AK, which means for a builder, it needs its own unique barrel. By the way, if you notice too, the sling mount is in the original AK style, and if this were a fixed stock gun, you'd still have the rear swivel on the receiver, not on the stock. And if you had a fixed stock, it would still have a 2-tang system like the mill gun. So they really did carry over quite a few elements. At least early on, it even had the slab side, the smooth top cover. Now this is export contract version, so it has the ribbed AKM style cover. It's also very possible that late domestic 68s had it as well. I mentioned the barrel and needing a special thing. Talking about the Asian contract build, we have a nominally numbers matching kit. The Koreans actually serialized quite a few parts, more than a lot of other nations. But it has to have its own special barrel. This is an AK Builder barrel. It is chrome lined, so that's good at least. And it needs its own Type 68 style receiver. And this is from Childers, a maker that I do really like. It has a hot blue finish, and the rest of the parts have their original Korean style blued finish, what have you. Oh, another thing too, the rear sight. You know, your original AK, it's 800 meters. With the AKM, it goes to 1,000 on a lot of guns. Well, the Koreans, like the Chinese, kept the 800. Now, the domestic guns would have Korean markings for the battle setting. They would do other markings for export, including some in Arabic. And the selector markings would be different ways too. Obviously, the Korean ones for domestic use would have their own markings. Strangely, they don't seem to have marked the safe position, just the single and full auto. For export, they either did like a 1 and an affinity sign, or like on this one, the SAR type markings. Just, you know, different differences for their different customers over the years, and different production runs, different factories. It happens. But with that, let's kind of tear this down and talk about the parts that were still carried over from the original Type 58 and some of the new parts for the Type 68 and why they're there, and just, you know, have fun looking at it, because that's the deal. When these kits very first started coming in, didn't think a whole lot about them. I thought, okay, it's just kind of another AKM with some, maybe a little bit of Chinese elements. I didn't realize that the devil's in the details. It's the sum total of the things. You could not put one of these together trying to find each individual piece, because they're all kind of their own thing. Very, very few are actually AKM spec. So let's pop the top. It comes apart just like any other AK, and then we'll look at one side.
Wolf ammo. It is a good runner.
Alrighty. Got her stripped apart here. I'm going to do my best to hopefully show you at least some of the close-ups. I understand if I can't always do it. Here's that barrel. It has a major step up here where it goes in. Here we have the traditional retainer. And we have a very unique gas block. Notice this, the slab side, the straight sides to it, and the top. This is a machined part. They did not go to casting like Russia and others would in the 70s. And they did that basically just to save on machine steps. Why not? Now, it is ported like an AKM. It doesn't have that on the tube. There is that. Funny thing, the cleaning rod is actually a different spec too. This is much thinner than on a regular AKM. Our front sight base is also machined, and it's also simplified. It does have a lightning cutter too, but yeah, it's a pretty chunky, blocky thing, especially this window here. And the muzzle nut. Now, some of these would have the slant brake. This one just has the nut, but you'll notice it itself is simplified. It doesn't have the additional lightning cut back there. Kind of reminds me of the early style that the Russians used, but it is a simplified nut, as funny as that is. The underside of the bayonet lug is also shaped a little different. Our rear sight. Now there are several variations, but this is the one with the kind of a convex checkering on it. There's also just a straight one without any checkering at all. We'll see little changes in production over the years there. We do have a standard style forged front trunnion, but again, if the specs are different, that leads in here. Just like with the Type 58, the North Korean issue ones would have Type 68, actually 68 type, and then have a star. But for the export, they didn't do that. Plausible deniability. Simplified feed ramp area. Actually retains the double hook trigger system of the original AK-47. It never had, of course, in a semi-automatic it wouldn't anyway, but even in the military versions, the select fires, it did not have the out-of-battery safety, the quote-unquote rate reducer. The disconnector is also a unique pattern. And speaking of unique, the way the underfolding stock interfaces back here, this whole thing is unique to the 68-1. I know some maintain that 68-1 is not the correct designation for the underfolding version. I'm going to use it here just for clarity's sake. Sorry. And of course it's riveted in. Now it's a different pattern than the Chinese. Also, if you were to see in here where the pistol grip comes up, the nut for the grip is actually part of the receiver. It's fixed in place. It's not free floating like on a lot of your AKs. Zastava also did something similar. And then we can flip it over to the underside to see me hit you with the sling. That's the danger of me moving the camera closer. So we flip it over and we see another very iconic part of this gun, the ridged trigger guard. Yeah, that's not something you typically see in an AK. That's a reinforcing, because this is relatively thin stamped steel. That was one of the economies. So yeah, and that leads up to the magazine catch area. Notice it still has 2 rivets per side, unlike the later Chinese. And the mag catch, there's at least 2 major styles. There's kind of the original milled style, and then there's the later stamped AKM style with more of the hump to it like mine does here. So that's correct for what it is. So you're already kind of seeing areas where they carried over old stuff and areas where they found places to add stampings and remove machining steps to keep costs low. Moving to the gas tube and upper handguard assembly, this is one I really find it interesting. Now first off, you'll notice neither the upper or lower have the springs added in later Soviet style to keep tension on them, to keep them from moving around. Oh no, we're not doing that. But what I really enjoy, you'll notice there's a seam here on this side. And if you look, it comes down right there. Yeah, the gas tube is made out of a piece of sheet steel that's rolled and spot welded together. And it's pretty thin gauge too. This is a noticeably lighter feeling assembly than on most AKMs. And the lever is the same here. As we've already looked at, and then there's the lower retainer. So that all goes on the same. Yeah, and without any kind of spring there, fitting it is just, of course, these are well-worn parts too, but still. So that's some of the areas. The selector, it's a pretty standard arm there. Reposition as we discussed. The controls are pretty standard. And stock, if you like the downward sweep, it's not bad. With that said, let's move on and check out the bolt group. This would be serialized to the gun as well. Very standard. Since it's a kit build, it still has the trip. Standard piston with the appropriate amount of wiggle. As I say in many, many AK videos, that's a good thing. That's part of the design flexibility to have movement there. You don't want that rock solid if you can help it. If we pull our bolt out, no surprise that it's a floating firing pin. Pretty standard. But notice there's no lightning cuts here. You get the one cutout that's necessary. But otherwise, this is just a straight bore cylinder. They machined, but they had to. And that's one thing you'll notice. When it matters, when it's moving surfaces like this, the machining, the polishing, even the finishing is good. They did finish these out, because they did have access to a Russian spec, of course, when and where necessary. It's just when it wasn't, they didn't. And they felt like the lightning cuts were just a step they could skip. And that really does continue on to the carrier here. You can see some chattering in that channel. The handle itself, pretty basic. And then if you look on the sides, these aren't nice rounded cuts. They're very angular. Like they just passed through, they didn't shave them off, and that continues up here too. It honestly reminds me of World War II Mosins when they were trying to rush them out of the factory. And they have a lot of just angular cuts and things like left in there too. And obviously no lightning cut on the carrier, because why would we need that? No real surprises on the recoil assembly. This is the AKM wire style. They were able to save quite a bit there versus the original machined. And it's about as simplified as you can get. No shelf, no lip, straight wall sides there. Again, they did what had to be done, and no further. That said, movement, it's pretty smooth, honestly. That's just over the hammer there. And with the spring in, yeah, it is smooth. Keep in mind that while the stamped shell is Childers, the front and rear trunnions are the original parts, Kara's original part. So they did this about as well as they could given the situation. And then we have our top cover. Like I said, the one that folks usually think of is the smooth side one, but a lot of the export-oriented guns, later production guns like this, rather ribbed. But even here, it's not as, well, machined out, stamped out as an AKM. This is much softer. The ribbing is much softer. It's its own cover. There's no lip really here. It just feels like it's slightly thinner steel. And you can tell it's a Battlefield thing when I got it. You got this nice little dented hole. That's just how it came. But it is the matching cover, and I've had more than a few kits that have a spot there. It'll happen over time. But that's the kind of the beauty of this type of gun. It's a honest wear and tear gun that's been there, done that. And either You like it or you don't. And I'm not saying you're wrong if you prefer guns to look brand new. I get it. But this is one of those beggars can't be choosers type deals. And this gun definitely looks like it could tell stories. Top cover, for all of its being beat up, actually fits very well. And obviously the dent's not enough to impact function. The gun runs perfectly fine. Even with a couple of these mags that I had, which are well used surplus. They're flat back, tanker style, and these are North Korean contract. The standard mag we already talked about. It was made of steel. I've heard of both spine style, Russian style, and the Chinese kind of flat back, folded, welded style. You don't see many Korean mags. A lot of them have the star, but for export, especially when they didn't want their names tied to things, they would probably not do that. So you see at least a few different styles of steel mag. In the 70s or early 80s, they also started doing a very orange synthetic mag, what we would think of as Bakelite, a variant of the AG4, the Russian style, the Bakelite. Keep in mind, Russia introduced the Bakelite mag in 68 for 7.62 by 39. And Korea doing it, even though it was a little bit their own mix. It's kind of interesting. Now, China did a Bakelite look-alike, a faux Bakelite mag, but it was actually a more modern polymer. I think that might make North Korea the only other nation for military purposes that did a 7.62 by 39 Bakelite. Now, East Germany would do one for 5.45, but Bulgaria wouldn't. Yeah, there aren't that many nations that did Bakelites, and I am happy to get a couple of these tanker mags. Has the simplified kind of Chinese style follower too. And despite the wear and tear on the mags, they worked fine.
With the Grom ammo. A little more oomph.
Had some power behind it.
As far as what the mags came in, I don't know for the tanker mags what they use for pouches, but the standard mags, the Korean mag pouch was pretty much the same through the Type 58, Type 68, and the later Type 88. It was a 3-cell pouch, plus it had 2 pockets on the front / sides for other gear, whatever you might need. But what made it a little unique, instead of having a snap closure, a hole with a stud to go through it, it actually kind of had the style you might think of on a lot of Chinese pouches, like the chest rigs, where you have I think of them as a little wood knocker, a little kind of pill shape that goes through a cloth loop. So they use those as closures instead of the snaps. And they're heavy duty, web material, canvas material, but simplified, and from what I've been told, they're kind of a greenish, khaki, beige color, depending on the runs. Same goes for the slings. They're just basically a simple version of the Soviet sling. They don't really use much leather, except maybe one little leather keeper, maybe. And then they go to a very simplified snap up here. It's just thin. And then the webbing tends to be kind of heavy, thick, and coarse. And they too are that green, off-green, khaki-ish color. And are used on the 58, the 68, and even the 63, the Type 63 SKS. With that, we do have one more accessory to talk about. And this is only one I have thanks to a very generous donation a while back from a viewer and supporter on here. The very unique Type 68 bayonet. Now this has a more or less standard AKM bayonet lug here. Now the original Type 58 used the AK lug where you had the notch under the front sight. So that was pretty standard, although of course they made them domestically. For reasons, when they did the 68, they made a very unique hybrid design here. In fact, this probably looks like a milled AK bayonet at first, and it mostly is, frankly. Should also mention that we do see some different colorations. It's often said that the more green ones are export-oriented guns, Cuba, for example, and the more brownish, beigeish ones tend to be identified with the domestic North Korean issue. That's a good rule of thumb, but it's not 100% hard and fast. Anyway, the scabbard is basically, just a milled, 6X2, 6H2 type. It's relatively thin steel, no wire cutter, of course. You have essentially a sewn-on frog with a little bit of leather there. You see the canvas web they used. Yeah. And the blade, of course, continues on. Again, no provision for a wire cutter. We have a fuller. It's the longer style of the original AK. No sawback like an AKM, but the point is a bit of a hybrid of both. It does have more of that kind of hooked point from the AKM, but it's still a more narrow blade. It's all a hybrid. It really is. The ring, pretty standard. But, of course, on a milled Type 1 lug, you'd have your catch here. This is blank. We have pretty typical grip scales. That's because when we get to the back here, where you'd have the half ring on a milled, you do have a pretty standard AKM back pommel. So it just goes on. So the attachment is very AKM-esque, which is better, frankly. And it means this is a better knife. But it's not a utility knife. No saw blade, no wire cutter, nothing like that. So it's just that. But it is probably, in a lot of ways, the best of both worlds, I could argue. Not a bad one. Why did they go with this unique pattern? Maybe they liked it. Maybe they just already had production set up for this material and it was easier to modify the existing lines versus setting up a whole new production style. I have a feeling that's probably it. Still very cool, though. Even if you don't own AKs, if you're just a bayonet or knife collector, the North Korean is really one of a kind. So again, thanks to this being donated by a supporter who preferred to just kind of remain anonymous or use a pseudonym like I did the first time. But it's still, even quite a bit later in time, greatly appreciated. This will be one I never will get rid of just because, when someone gives me a gift, it matters a lot. Even better when it's a gift you actually really wanted. And that's our accessories, and that's our Type 68, or should I say Type 68-1 underfolder.
And one more go with the Asian contract.
I think you got him.
Good old underfolders.
All back together here, wonderful, comfy, underfolding stock and all. With North Korea able to increase its rate of production by switching to the Type 68 and soon thereafter expanding its armed forces, it's no wonder that the program to make the K2 was kicked off around 1972, 1973. And when they did design this, it was expressly meant to go up against, compete against, and be superior to the AK. And part of that was having the same reliability, durability, dependability, and frankly, at least a comparable level of ease of mass production. But then surpassing it when it came to accuracy, range, sights, even the ability to attach an optic, which is why they had the mounts here originally, whereas your typical North Korean AK did not have a scope mount as such. And just having a longer barrel and the bipod and all that things. Now, again, we featured this last time talking about S&T Defense and the possibility of getting new production semi-automatic Daewoo types, namely the K2S, which is cool. That may or may not happen, but what we can say, we're not getting new semi-automatic AKs out of North Korea. That ain't happening. Therefore, yeah, a kit build like this is really the only way to go. And because of, well, obvious relations with North Korea on both sides and all the animosity, we're not going to get surplus guns directly out of there. The only way to do it is through a third-party nation, and even then, it's pretty difficult because a lot of the places he's went to weren't places that we were going to be bringing guns out of. But luckily, back in 2022, these kits started to appear, and luckily, Childers started making the appropriate receivers, and AK Builder did a version of their barrel so that folks could build them up. And then in 2023, which is when I picked this up, Atlantic did their own full complete build here. And considering these are not the easiest builds to do for many reasons, yeah, I was perfectly happy to just get one from them that I knew would run, and if it didn't run, I could just send it back because I didn't frankly want the headache. And we were lucky enough to find some overseas stocks of 68s because, you know, North Korea was a major arms exporter. I'd say beginning with Cuba, relations with Cuba and Russia were up and down, and North Korea kind of stepped in doing the whole white knight thing. Oh, we'll supply you, and they made a big show of giving Cuba guns for free, 58s and 68s, and that's mostly, it's a kind of a mix. Vietnam, obviously the Vietnam War with the U.S., mostly the Americans would encounter Type 58s there. Maybe towards the end some 68s, but certainly after the Vietnam War, Vietnam would get more 68s, so it's entirely possible these could have been used against China in 1979. And then they would honestly begin to expand into the Middle East and South America. For example, Syria, they would first get complete guns, then they would get parts, and they would even do some relatively limited, but still there, licensed domestic production of the Type 68 within Syria, at least up until the Civil War. Moving into Africa, Ethiopia is a very similar case. They would get complete guns, and then North Korea would set up a production facility there, meaning that they could supply to other African nations and wherever else. So not only did they give domestic and foreign sales a go, they set up, yeah, they had ambition here. I'm not going to give them grief for that. These would also appear in other nations. Iraq and Iran would get some. A few other little nations here and there, they would trade about, usually via other nations, and they would, in more recent times, show up in the hands of Hamas, ISIS, Islamic Nation, that kind of thing. Not in huge numbers, but definitely floating around the Middle East and parts of Africa. As for South America, Cuba was a kind of a good entry point there. They would send some over to El Salvador and Nicaragua. One of the big users was Peru, of all things. It's pretty famous. In 1986, they would purchase under $100 per gun, 20,000 Type 68s for use by the paratroopers and other special units. And then 2 years later, I guess they liked them. They bought 20,000 more. And a lot of these would go to police, militias, paramilitary units, whatever. So Peru would get at least 40,000 in the 80s. And this is really when we start to see them just spreading out. And these are to help communist rebels, revolutionaries, insurgents. Obviously, the Iran-Contra affair was going on in America. Just a lot of meddling and one banana republic, one dictator after another. It's not a great time all around. But either way, these would spread around. You would very much see Type 68s floating around South America in the tens of thousands. So they got around. They really did. How many did they make? North Korea has never said. We don't know. We may never know. Heck, we don't even know for 100% sure they're no longer making these. We assume they are not, but they could be. Or they can start back up. Like I said, the gun was used domestically, and they increased their military up into the high hundreds of thousands. Now, they made 800,000 Type 58s. It stands to reason, especially considering how many they exported, they made more of these. I'm going to have to say at least 1 million, because they at least made these for 20 years versus 10, and they were faster to make. I could see even a couple of million. We just don't know. Because they were at least being made up through 1988, which is when this gun's replacement came around, known as the Type 88, which was a North Korean derivative of the AK-74. In a lot of ways, they took the Type 68 and changed it up enough to fire 5.45 by 39. North Korea was one of the few nations to adopt 5.45. It was not near as popular as 7.60 by 39, and today is one of the few nations still using it outside of Russia and Ukraine and that area there. Most nations that did adopt it, like Poland, switched away. And what we see is the Type 88, which I still insist that I think China helped them set up, just because there was that whole weird Chinese Type 88 5.45 gun that wasn't for the Chinese army. I digress. But they would give the 5.45 guns to the front line, the elite, the special units, meaning that the Type 68 could go to everyone else. And that let them kind of finally retire a lot of their old Type 58s and the Type 63s, although some are still shown in parades even today. But it just pushed it down the ladder a little bit, for what it's worth. So we assume that they kind of quietly discontinued production of the 68 and moved over to the 88. That said, because few nations adopted 5.45 by 39, I don't think they saw much export success. I don't know. I don't know how many they made. They're still very much in service today, and chances are we'll never know. And we don't know what the ratio is of Type 68 versus Type 68-1, fixed stock versus underfolder. It's just cool to have something to study, because I really did not realize how different the parts really are until getting them in hand. The gas tubes still play my favorite feature. So I was really stoked when these Asian contract builds came out, and it's one of my favorites today. Well, with that, let's let my youngest brother put a few rounds through it. There's a few left in that box.
Let John give her a try. It's an AK.
It's an AK.
Definitely one I'm very thankful they did. As far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, I know Childers does make a fixed stocked receiver for the Korean style, the 68 style. I don't believe Atlantic has done a run of fixed stocked 68s, but I could be wrong on that. And I don't think they've done that many. I know they've kind of floated in and out of stock on their website over the last 2.5 years. I know the price was never cheap. Your mileage may vary if you think it's worth it. It just depends what level of crazy AK collector you are. I thought it was a decent deal considering it needed its own proprietary parts. And partially because of the spec, partially because of the just wear and tear on the original parts, it wasn't a build I wanted to tackle. I'm not much of an AK builder. As I said at the beginning, I'm mostly an import person. But there are just some guns, if you want them in your collection, you're going to have to settle on a kit build. And I'm going to be honest with you. I said East Germany is another one. If you made me decide which one to sell, this or my East German, I'd probably sell my East German. East German's neat and all, but it's basically just an AKM with different furniture and a different front sling swivel. This is different in almost every way. Different furniture to North Korea, the gas tube, the trigger guard. I love the slab side gas block. And it shoots really well. Again, for an underfolder, they're not, especially the down sweep style, aren't the most comfy. So yeah, it's one I'm very thankful for. One I'm glad I kind of picked up. And back in the day, it was kind of a lark. I just was wanting something new back then, and this was available. And besides, it kind of matches my woos. I picked both of mine up on the day woo front a long time ago, back when they were not that crazy money-wise, and that's actually because I had one come in for a buddy at the gun shop. He ordered it in, and I did the transfer, and I thought, this is a slick gun. So the next time one came my way, I picked it up. And this is kind of the deal here. Just showing both nations and their different things. And technically, they're still not at full peace. It's still a war with an armistice. And a very interesting situation. And this is a very interesting piece of AK history, where a lot of different influences combine. Would I like to have a Type 58? Sure. But if you said I could only have one, a 58 or a 68, I'd rather have the 68 because it's more unique. The 58, again, pretty much just like a Russian gun with a little bit rougher fit and finish and different markings and different, wood furniture. That's neat and all, but I like things to be more distinct. Would I rather have an underfolder or a fixed stock? For shooting, a fixed stock. But I don't own very many underfolders. I really don't. If you've watched a lot of my videos, you'll notice I just don't. So I think having another one in the collection actually gives a little bit better feeling of diversity. So I'm cool with this being an underfolder. And I don't know if the exports tended to lean towards the underfolder or if quite a few fixed stocks were sent over to. I just know we're kind of lucky to have received these. Did they come out of Africa? Did they come out of the Middle East? Were they some of the guns knocking around Iraq, Iran all those years? Probably, maybe, who knows. But the thing is, once a gun's in a foreign country for enough time, it can be from that country, not from the original country, because an import license for anything marked country of origin of North Korea, that ain't happening. So the way to do it is it sits in a foreign country long enough you can say it came from that country, and that's when it's just a, quote, Asian contract. And when these first came out, it was something that was kept very quiet for legal reasons and just not to rock the boat. But here we are, 2-3 years later, the cat's out of the bag. It is what it's going to be. And therefore, I don't really worry about talking about it. But both Korean guns, the South and the North, I'm pretty thankful for. Maybe we'll find another cache from another third party later on. That'd be pretty cool. I'd love to see some Type 88s, but I don't think they've exported those. I think the relatively small number compared to the 68s they've made are still very much in North Korean DPRK service. So don't think we're going to see that. But it was a good old rainy day. Luckily, we were able to get out and run a few rounds through this, including a couple of different ammo types. It's a good runner. Wouldn't be my first choice for everyday shooter, of course, but it's unique. It's one that people definitely react to when you show it to them. And I think Atlantic did a very good job of building it up. What do you think? And how's your holiday going?
You know, it's still pretty early afternoon, and it's just still dark and grizzly today. Good day to hole up with Miss Peanut and her little sister in the cabin, I'd say.
Alrighty. Well, with that, appreciate hanging out, talking AKs. I would love to hear your comments below on really anything relevant, including, new stuff maybe on Black Friday. As always, if you could, like, share, subscribe. Again, you could do a super thanks on here if you'd like to help support. You can go over on Patreon and check it out. And if not, looking at some of the old videos, pretty much covered all the AKs that are out there that are military. I'm not really much onto the civilian spec-only guns. I like guns that have a military pedigree, even if they're replicas. So that's kind of what I do. And this fits in very well. It's actually probably one of the even though it's been 2.5 years since I picked it up, it's probably one of the more recent AKs I've picked up. I just haven't found anything in the last few years that really trips my trigger. That's okay, though. It's perfectly nice just to be satisfied with what you have. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon after some resting next time.